Welcome to our webinar, Building a Catalyst-Responsive Technology Strategy. My name is Kevin Pang, Vice President of Consulting here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Our speaker today is Naveen Krishnamurthy, Director of Consulting out of our New York office. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all of the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. At this point, I would like to introduce Lux Research's Naveen Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for joining us as we try to find ways to prepare for catalysts. Clearly, we're in the midst of one pernicious catalyst, COVID-19. We're hearing about the new normal, the next normal, and back to normal. These invoke the idea that there is something called a benign normalcy, an untarnished world to get back to. This catalyst is also shining a light on our own predispositions. How do we respond to catalysts? With a sense of hope or a sense of foreboding? On December 24th, 1968, astronaut Bill Anders, aboard Apollo 8 on the first manned spacecraft to the moon, took this incredible picture of Earth as seen from the moon. This picture brought to light our lives on this incredibly peaceful, majestic, and utopian marble planet in the midst of a cold, formidable universe. Back then, humanity was filled with the sense that we're fragile, but that there's hope and solidarity in society, that tomorrow will be a better day. Since then, others like former vice presidents and others have warned us that the world is not a utopia, that in fact a dystopia is soon to be upon us, mobilized by our own actions, that society, planet, and economy are all headed downhill. So what is this world? A place of wonder or a dismal, chaotic mess? Is hope the key or is fear the key? This thinking was brought to the fore for us via numerous discussions with clients that are asking questions like, what will the chemical industry look like in the far future of 2040? Or what does step-out innovation mean as we build a bridge to the misty future of 2030? And even what an acquisition strategy should look like in consumer product packaging in a post-COVID 2021. And this is how we begin our journey with you for the next 30 minutes. We will first discuss an approach for catalyst-responsive technology strategy. We will then bring to you what we learned in service of clients in developing what is a catalyst-ready technology strategy. We'll walk through how one company's experiences and actions when faced with a pressing catalyst brings all this to focus. We think by the end of this discussion, you'll have a better grasp of how to frame your thinking around catalysts that are yet to come. Well, no matter what one's utopian or dystopian predisposition to the world, as technology strategists, we've all used megatrends and trends to begin analyzing industry behavior. Our conversations with clients have told us that these 5 megatrends encapsulate today's world. Each of these megatrends impinges on society, planet, economy, and technology. Each megatrend is made up of several trends, which in turn are shaping the evolution of size, growth, and even the transmutation of industries and companies. These trends have shaped, for example, how 70% of the US economy is composed of consumer purchases that are more and more centered around services on the right half of this slide, rather than on products that come from manufacturing on the left half of this slide. So yes, megatrend analysis is not new, but it's the foundation for what we'll discuss next. So how does a megatrend like climate change and its 3 constituent trends influence an industry like agriculture? Well, here at Lux, we've been analyzing megatrends and trends for many clients for close to 2 decades. At a very simple level, the baseline effects of trends on industries breaks down into 3 parameters: pace or speed of trend, size of the industry in question, and the materiality of trend to the industry. It's the angle of attack of a trend to the industry. So these three parameters give us, we think, sufficient basis to analyze influences of trends on industries and even on companies in these industries. All that's great in a baseline environment of general equilibrium. And then something happens that destabilizes that equilibrium. So for 4,000 years, farms have been afflicted by swarms of billions of locusts, consuming the equivalent of 1 pound of vegetation for every American, all in one day, challenging the equilibrium and catalyzing pre-existing trends in hunger and famine in large parts of the world that are still agrarian, and catalyzing responses from governments, companies, startups, like GPS tracking kits in combination with satellite imagery and infrared drones to track locust infestations so that early interventions by pesticides can be implemented. Actions catalyzed by a catalyst called locust infestation. So what is a catalyst? Even if we credibly define a catalyst, how are we to measure its impacts given the framing that we've just introduced? What are the impacts of a locust upsurge on agriculture in, say, East Africa? Well, number one, a spike in use of fertilizers to be able to rapidly grow a new crop to make up for the crop that the locusts have just decimated. Number two, continued and rapid drawdown of water from underground aquifers to water those new crops. And number three, acceleration of migration trends of humans from farms to urban centers and to surrounding countries, seeding conflict. By creating these impacts, these locust swarms are essentially accelerating land and water scarcity. So the arrival of a catalyst modifies pre-existing trends. Essentially, catalysts are trend modifiers. We've seen this before, haven't we? In this century and before, catalysts have not just changed our view of the world, but also shaped pre-existing trends. So at Lux, we've been assessing how the rise in shale E&P has impacted adjacent industries like produced water treatment technologies. We've looked at how the onset of 5G is influencing entirely new antenna designs and materials and so on. And as we do this, we can start to trace the degree of propulsion that each catalyst provides to pre-existing trends. Our analysis shows that just like in a chemistry laboratory, a catalyst's primary mode of impact is in changing the pace of underlying trends, thereby accelerating or decelerating how pre-existing trends are shaping industries. So we can start visualizing the impact of locusts as a catalyst on agriculture by seeing how these three trends as part of climate change from before the arrival of the catalyst to after the arrival of locust catalyst. What's behind this visualization is a quantification of the trends pre and post catalyst. When you extend this analysis to a broader list of industries, a heat map lights up with trends and megatrends on top, industries in the rows on the left. This is a new way to look at a catalyst, isn't it? You measure a catalyst's impacts by feeding the catalyst through each of the trends influencing your industry or the target industry you want to enter. A technology strategist can take this and determine how to respond. So pace of trend, size of industry, materiality of trend to industry, and impact of catalyst on pace of trend. These are the parameters that lead to this quantification and tapestry of analysis. So if we believe that this analysis or analysis like this is useful, why do we wait to do this in the heat of the battle after a catalyst has arrived? When biases and the fog of war, those things are our best friends. Why don't we do this before a catalyst even arrives on the scene? Not just a catalyst responsive technology strategy, but a catalyst ready technology strategy. So why do we wait for catalysts to show up before we plan, prepare, and commit to action? Well, strategists, economists, policymakers, and farmers, just like all humans, are creatures of habit. Recent history says that locust upsurges have been fewer and far between due to decades of human intervention. Until the Great Recession, economic recessions were getting fewer and far between as well. So there's a host of cognitive and emotional biases wrapped up in human thinking that's demonstrated here. Availability bias, confirmation bias, fear of fear, and other things, until we find that the locust upsurge that began last December is blooming to become a catalyst not seen in 70 years, an extreme catalyst. And we get this. Drastic enough that the Ugandan army has been called out to spray pesticides. And by now, many of you have already perceived the parallels between the locust crisis with the pandemic that's raging across 6 continents. Extreme catalysts, we think, have a common quality to them. We've seen versions of them before. We've dealt with them then. We didn't expect them to reoccur, but they're here again now. So there's an unpredictability to the occurrence of extreme catalysts. When they occur, they start out with a weak signal that we often mistake for noise. And once they arrive, these extreme catalysts rapidly overwhelm us. So there's unpredictability around impact. So both timing and impact are hard to predict. So these extreme catalysts, what are known as high sigma events, are these black swans? Is COVID-19 a black swan? Well, Nassim Taleb, the author who popularized this idea of black swans, might differ from that view. A locust upsurge is really improbable. Was the Columbia shuttle disaster in 2003, or the BP offshore oil rig blow up in 2010, or COVID-19, highly improbable. Hard to predict, hard to understand, hard to prepare for, yes. Highly improbable, maybe not. These are the known unknowns, uncertainty brought on by imperfect information. Gray swans. So we're talking about probabilities, aren't we? Probabilities that lie between known knowns on one end and unknown unknowns on the other end. If we are to prepare for catalysts, even extreme catalysts, how can we predict the arrival of catalysts no matter what color of probability they wear? We think for a technology strategist, there are 3 key steps to setting up a catalyst-ready technology strategy: perceive, prepare, and practice. Perceive is about monitoring weak signals, understanding how trends are evolving and why, and contemplating the types of catalysts those trends could be most vulnerable to. Catalysts such as supply shocks, an emerging technology, a geopolitical event, a regulatory event. This step is not about fleshing out what all the impacts of a catalyst can be. Rather, this is about simply firming up your domain awareness of what exists, what could shift, and why. And transitioning to imagine in a non-linear fashion, as opposed to simply extrapolating from the past. Now, the next step is to prepare. Preparing for the kinds of catalysts that you've contemplated. That preparation begins with developing a view of the world where that catalyst arrives, stays, and propagates. Assessing the implications from that catalyst vis-a-vis pre-existing trends, the way we illustrated earlier in today's webinar. Except we're doing it not after a catalyst arrives, but well before. And finally, practice. This involves learning from prior experiences with catalysts. How did your industry react? What parallels can you draw from those experiences to the catalyst that you're preparing for? And finally, putting this all together once the catalyst does arrive. Of course, learning from practice and looping it all back to help you better perceive and prepare for the next catalyst. The true test in all of this is whether the organization as a whole or vital strategic metrics can spring back after encountering that next catalyst. I want to focus on a framework for the preparation step. Let's say you formulated a few catalysts to be prepared for your company. Well before any of those catalysts arrives, you want to put in place a catalyst-ready technology strategy to be prepared for impacts, which in turn requires that we have the right scenarios formulated. Are these scenarios sufficiently far ahead? Are these sufficiently grounded in reality? Are these scenarios imaginative to accommodate realities we've not yet seen in the past? In the realm of scenario planning, there are many ways to conduct these scenarios. Here's a couple. Number one, the first is exploratory scenarios. Take what you know contemplate questions that say what if, and assign numerical probabilities based on empirical models. The problem with this approach is who knows exactly how well stories of the past can precisely predict the future, especially a future that challenges the Gaussian distribution. And we're talking about gray swans, aren't we? These occur in the tails of these distribution curves. If predicting these tails is difficult, what are the chances we can accurately predict outcomes from events that sit in these tails? Very low. All this to say, purely probabilistic models give us the comfort of preparing for the last catalyst, thereby leaving us potentially unprepared for the next. The second type of scenario building is normative scenarios. This says, let's imagine a world that the child's eye sees is the best normative future, and therefore, through backcasting, come up with a series of required evolutionary steps to get to that scenario and the opportunities and challenges along the way. The problem with this approach is it fails to contemplate negative futures and implications. So what do? Is there a way to combine the best of the two scenario building approaches? Is there a way to be prepared for future catalysts by incorporating imagination to create distinct and divergent futures, but don't simply rely on past models, which make us have to sort through dozens of impacts, which in turn leads to hundreds of subsequent options? Remember our conversation about bipolar worlds, a utopian world or a dystopian world? Why not craft scenarios that make room for both utopia and dystopia in an integrated framework? How do we accomplish this? Well, we know that catalysts modify trends. We're trying to imagine how each trend could experience an immediate upside or an immediate downside. What are the chances that either world should take shape? We don't profess to know, and in the midst of imperfect information, we should be prepared for either eventuality equally. So we believe that the probability should stay at 50%. Now we could stop here and explore all of the implications across every trend in your industry and determine opportunities and risks. Living through COVID-19, however, is telling us that impacts don't just occur in a vacuum. Once the immediate impact occurs, government, industry, society, they all react, and there's subsequent impacts from those actions. How do you account for these? We need to take this further into what happens next. But what happens next is, in either world, upon seeing the immediate impact, you take action. Companies don't just watch the future, they shape the future for themselves. Your action could by itself be about embracing the catalyst and flying in its slipstream, or it could be about retreating and hunkering down from that catalyst. We model both behaviors. Those behaviors in turn lead impacts. Your industry's action or your company's action could in turn create enormous upside or enormous downside in each step in either world. And as we do this, it's forcing us to be open, isn't it? Open to asking ourselves the question, are we fully exploiting the utopian possibility after a catalyst's immediate impact? Are we sufficiently braced for a dystopian outcome? Are we open to the possibility that a seemingly negative catalyst can, as time progresses, reveal that the outcomes are net positive? And as you do this, you're going to run into overlap. These are the impacts that have relatively high chances of occurring. These overlapping impacts are the ones that you should be especially prepared for any given catalyst. Because therein lie the opportunities that provoke your organization's capabilities. What else happens? You start seeing a bunch of non-overlapping impacts, a utopian impact and a dystopian impact at a single point in time. Those are also important, because those specific utopian and dystopian pairs allow you to create technology hedging strategies. And hedging is a hallmark of building a calibrated portfolio of technologies with suitable risk-reward profiles for a target horizon. And of course, you can look at the outliers in this analysis and determine whether you should be prepared for those impacts, how, and if so, at what cost. So far, we've seen that developing a catalyst-ready technology strategy means to a large part preparing for the impacts of a range of catalysts. And those impacts can be channeled into a bipolar, best of times and worst of times scenario building exercise, which then opens us up to both opportunities and risks. Let's pull this all together with one company that we all know. That's General Motors. This granddaddy of internal combustion automotive engineering experienced its highs in the 1960s, with 1 in 2 cars sold in America having a GM sticker on it. Well, since then, comparative forces, recessions, and other things led this company to lose much of its market share. And by 2000, 3 trends had taken hold in automotive manufacturing. First, supply chain was becoming global, and GM was spending about $1 billion every year to ship parts to distant factories to satisfy local demand. And demand was growing as countries in Latin America and Asia became rising economic powers. And lastly, energy transition. This meant that while Toyota was only able to sell 5,000 cars for Prius in 2000, it was selling 140,000 Priuses by 2009, a 28-fold increase in 9 years. But for GM, 2009 brought another milestone. On the back of the Great Recession, the company's debt burden and pension obligations, among other things, led the US government to bail out GM. Coming out of the bailout program in 2010, when GM IPO'd, it raised $20 billion, the biggest IPO in US history until then. But that same year, a small electric vehicle company called Tesla, with a devoted following, raises 1/100th of that listing, relatively small opening on public equity exchanges. And GM was not new to electrification. GM had plans to introduce the Volt plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. But as a veteran of many catalysts, GM quickly realized that the arrival of Tesla in public equity markets captivated institutional investors' attention, potential car owners' imagination, and accelerated trends in electrification. So Tesla, as a startup company, was acting as a catalyst. What does GM do? Well, GM's response was to approach each of these trends and find a way in which they can address each of them. To reduce costs, GM decided to build local supply chains for each of its vehicle fleets in key geographies. China was eclipsing the US as the next big car and truck market, so GM started ramping up there. GM now, today, sells more cars in China than it does in the US. And the company just doubled down on building and partnering its way to an electric future. How does what followed next play out from a utopian dystopian perspective? We're going to run through a series of actions and outcomes to see how GM appears to have applied this bipolar world model. Well, GM started selling the Volt in 2010 and aggressively marketed the vehicle. Volt sales could have gone up or gone down. And by 2014, Volt sales were slipping. Tesla's IPO in 2010 told GM that if GM did not treat this catalyst, Tesla, seriously, GM would find itself never being able to recover its past glory. So GM had already been working on a fleet of other EVs that could piggyback on the Volt, no matter how the Volt performed. If Volt sales went up, a utopian future, or Volt sales went down, a dystopian future, GM was going to be prepared. How do we know this? Well, automotive new product development cycle is about 3 to 6 years. GM introduced an improved EV model called the Bolt, with a B, in 2015, 2016. So the company had to have been working on the Bolt design as early as 2011, a year after the Tesla IPO. And in fact, the overlap is where GM was most focused on. The Bolt had greater driving range and came in hatchback versions, which the company's research found was a preferred option for its target customer here in the US. So what happened as a result of that action? Well, either Bolt sales could have gone up dramatically or gone down precipitously. And as it turns out, Bolt sales started to stagnate in 2018, but GM was ready. How do we know this? Because 3 years earlier, right around 2015, GM started realizing the full impact of Tesla as a catalyst. So what Tesla was doing was validating the tried and tested approach. Introduce a new technology in premium vehicles first. This gives the car maker sufficient runway to work on costs for a few years to subsequently be able to release that same technology on value-driven vehicles. At a minimum price tag of $75,000 in 2015, the Tesla Model S had set the standard for quality, style, and price for an EV. On the other hand, GM's mass market Volt and then the Bolt were just not cutting it, even with a $35,000 price tag, and more importantly, the associated quality and styling. So by 2015, 2016, General Motors realized that no matter which way Bolt sales went, the company's opportune path ahead was in the overlap. GM had to introduce luxury EV models. So in March this year, the company announced its BEV3 platform targeted at premium vehicles, Cadillac and Hummer drivetrains. So by preparing and acting in the overlaps twice, once in 2015 and again in 2020, GM has exemplified how a company can conceive of bipolar futures and be prepared for opportunities in these overlaps. What's next? What if sales for GM's BEV3 platform on the Cadillac and Hummer really take off next year? Or what if GM's premium EV sales disappoint? Well, if sales do go up, GM knows that that's great, but if there's one thing that the owner of a $75,000 electric Cadillac doesn't want, it's to be stranded on a long trip without a charging station in sight. So, to address range anxiety, GM is already working on a partnership with Bechtel, a large construction company, to roll out charging stations here in the US. But if sales go down, then GM would have to improve profitability in its EVs by taking out costs. And the company is already working on that. GM is working on NMCA batteries, which take costs out of the battery. GM is also working on a simplified manufacturing process that reduces the number of parts that go into an EV, thereby taking out costs in production. So we think this is an example of hedging for either future, a utopian or dystopian future. And we think what's behind all of these actions and outcomes is a mental model of conceiving of the world through a lens of utopia and dystopia and being prepared dispassionately for either future. And preparation in GM's case meant repeatedly solving for best opportunities and hedging for risks. Now, shareholders are not going to reward companies for expecting dystopia and successfully finding dystopia time and time again, but companies do get rewarded, we think, for anticipating with openness, preparing ahead of a catalyst, and communicating that that's what they're doing. You know, the author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, is quoted as saying, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. That means that a bipolar approach to preparing for catalysts leads to good strategic foresight. I think our webinar has likely given you the framing to explore that further. So as you think about implementing this thinking in your organization, we ask that you think about three things. Catalysts indeed are trend modifiers. The approach we've laid out forces us to be prepared for the best of times as well as the worst of times in anticipation of catalysts and their impacts. And that means seeking opportunities and hedging for risks as you prepare for a catalyst, are essentially flip sides of the same coin. Thank you for joining us on this brief journey.
Thank you, Naveen. Well, that concludes our webinar for today. We will now take questions from the audience about the presentation, which you can type into your questions box. If we don't get to your questions on this call, please persevere because someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. Let me lead off with first question for you, Naveen. One of the comments is, this is a very interesting framework, looking at polar opposites for scenario building. How might one use this to contemplate market adjacencies?
Yeah, so there's different ways to detect and then measure what an adjacency is, so you can apply some of this thinking for that. Typically, clients come to us and say, well, either help us find an adjacency, or we've already identified an adjacency, should we enter or not? So it's about go, no go. What we are proposing is the thinking that we've explained shows you a way to think about adjacencies not as a yes or no, and maybe not even just as purely an extension of your existing capabilities, but rather adjacencies as a way to diversify away from doubling down on your existing capabilities. So what might seem like disparate markets for you at the outset you may realize as you look and measure for adjacencies behave similarly to catalyst-initiated trends that accelerate those same trends in both your existing core, but also in those adjacencies. Do you want exposure to that type of adjacency? Or would you rather have the opportunity to enter an adjacency that does not give you that doubling down, but instead allows you to hedge risks? So that's the thinking that we want you to walk away with.
Talking a little bit more about catalysts, you mentioned that it is possible to try to quantitatively measure either impact or pacing or directional force, right, on a trend. How does Lux go about assessing that?
Yeah, so we're going to have to start with data that is unimpeachable. And it's hard to do that in today's world, but there's a few sources of such unimpeachable data, things that others have corroborated, found to be true, and so on. And one of those pieces of data is global GDP growth and how that GDP growth breaks down into individual geographies or individual industries. So we can start comparing how the pace or momentum of trends or the catalyst as they pose this effects on trends compares to the baseline global GDP growth rate or the GDP growth rate in your particular geography. And then the question then becomes, okay, based on that as baseline, what is the type of growth we can anticipate? What is the type of disruption in that growth can that catalyst effect? And so that is one of the ways in which we can start quantifying, measuring, and assessing.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase one question here. How do you prevent or overreacting to any catalyst or trend?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So I think the questioner is probably asking, how do you make sure that you don't blow up the potential impact of a catalyst, either utopian or dystopian? And yes, there is that consideration, but the approach that we showed you lays out a step-by-step approach by which you're amplifying certain signals to make sure that you're prepared for either the upside or the negative. But at the same time, it's forcing us to think, are we really capturing the upside for what might seem like an initially negative catalyst? And then are we making sure that we're looking at the downside of a seemingly positive catalyst? That forced thinking, that imagination that brings, that we are asking for you to intercede into your thinking, I think also leads to a definitive quantifying, a need for quantifying. And so one way you can start doing is after you've initially resolved your approach, your mental model for 50% probabilities, then use your data, use your own expertise, use your own experience to start thinking about tweaking those probabilities to make sure that, maybe a lot of evidence does point you to more reliably want to participate in one of those two bipolar futures as opposed to the other, just because you have advanced warning through your own weak signal analysis and because of certain relationships you may have with others who will also participate with you in this catalyst impeded or catalyst accelerated trend.
Great. Thanks, Naveen. Well, this concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email today. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we do appreciate any feedback you have to help inform and improve future webinars. So thanks for joining us, and have a great day.